I told you can't trust these. Now Puffy done killed Tupac, man.
50 Cent didn't just stir conversation when he began speaking about the murders of Tupac Shakur and the notorious B.I.G. He reignited a fire that the hip-hop world never truly put out. For decades, fans have argued, speculated, and searched for answers. But the truth always seemed buried beneath power, money, and silence. When 50 Cent suggested that a list of influential figures may have been connected to the deaths of these two legends, it felt less like gossip and more like a warning. Almost immediately, the mood shifted. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This felt like unfinished business coming back to collect its debt. Then came the documentary, released quietly on Netflix on a bright Tuesday morning. It didn't take long before the entire internet was talking about it. People described it as something they didn't know they were waiting for. 50 Cent's documentary on the rise and fall of Shawn Combs didn't arrive with flashy promotion or celebratory headlines. Instead, it came heavy, uncomfortable, and raw. From the very first moments, it became clear this was not designed to protect reputations or preserve legacies. It was designed to expose. Unseen footage, raw audio, and voices long ignored suddenly had a platform. And once they started talking, it was impossible to look away. Watching the documentary feels like standing in a dark room, where someone suddenly turns on the lights. For years, fans only saw the surface chart-topping hits, luxury lifestyles, award shows, and magazine covers. But behind the scenes, the story was very different. Former employees, artists, and insiders describe an atmosphere built on fear, pressure, and manipulation. The second episode of the series pushes even further, peeling back layers that many believe were intentionally hidden. This chapter, part of a larger story titled Shawn Combs, The Reckoning, feels colder, heavier, and far more dangerous than the first. As the episode unfolds, former Bad Boy Records staff and artists step forward, each telling their version of what life inside the label was really like. These are not bitter outsiders chasing attention. These are people who were there when the music was being made, when the money was flowing, and when tensions were quietly building. When they begin speaking about Tupac and Biggie, the tone changes completely. Their voices lower, their words slow down, and suddenly it becomes clear that these deaths were not isolated tragedies, but part of a much larger and far more disturbing picture. Rapper Mark Curry speaks openly about the environment he experienced, describing a label that thrived on control rather than creativity. Roxanne Johnson, the ex-wife of Craig Mack, adds another layer, offering insight into how artists were treated and how little protection they truly had. But it is Bad Boy co-founder Kirk Burroughs who delivers some of the most shocking claims in the entire documentary. According to Burroughs, Shawn Combs was not just aggressive in business, he was obsessed with dominance. He describes Combs as someone who felt threatened by the very artists he signed, driven by jealousy and fear of losing control. One of the most disturbing moments comes when Burroughs claims he was forced to give up his share of Bad Boy Records under threat. He recalls Shawn Combs wielding a baseball bat, making it clear that refusal could lead to serious consequences. This wasn't a heated argument or a corporate dispute. It was intimidation, plain and simple. The image of a powerful music mogul resorting to fear and violence completely reshapes how viewers understand the empire that was built. Suddenly, success looks less like talent and vision and more like force and coercion. The documentary then pulls viewers back into the most infamous era in hip-hop history, the East Coast versus West Coast War of the 1990s. On the surface, it was framed as a rivalry between artists Biggie Smalls representing New York and Tupac Shakur standing for the West. But those closest to the situation tell a different story. They claim the artists were pawns, trapped in a game they didn't fully control. Behind the scenes, executives and power players were fueling the conflict, feeding egos, and encouraging hostility because controversy meant attention and attention meant money. Bad Boy Records, home to Biggie, Faith Evans, Maze, and 112, stood as the face of the East Coast. Death Row Records, led by Suge Knight with Dr. Dre and later Tupac, dominated the West. The tension between the labels escalated quickly, spilling from diss tracks into real-life confrontations. According to multiple voices in the documentary, Shawn Combs played a significant role in escalating these tensions. Instead of de-escalating conflict, he allegedly allowed it to grow, believing he could control the chaos without consequences. But chaos is never controllable. As egos clashed and threats intensified, the rivalry left the studios and entered the streets. The documentary explains how gang affiliations became entangled in the feud, turning music industry disputes into real-world violence. Allegedly, Crips became associated with Biggie's side, While Bloods aligned with Suge Knight and Death Row, once gangs entered the picture, the rules changed. This was no longer about reputation, it was about survival. At the center of this web of connections, Shawn Combs is portrayed as a man standing between the industry and the streets. His name becomes linked to Dwayne "Keffy D. Davis through Eric Von Zip Martin, someone Combs reportedly referred to as his uncle. Von Zip was known in New York street circles and allegedly served as a bridge between the music world and criminal networks. These relationships, once dismissed as rumors, are presented in the documentary as serious and dangerous connections that may have had deadly consequences. The most chilling moments arrive when the documentary plays recordings involving Keffy D himself, alongside commentary from a former police detective. Viewers hear Keffy D discussing the events of the night Tupac Shakur was shot in Las Vegas in 1996. In a calm, almost casual tone, Keffy D admits that he and Orlando Anderson were involved in the attack. Hearing these words directly, without filters or speculation, is shocking. For years, fans suspected this truth. Now they were hearing it straight from the source. Tupac survived the shooting for several days, fighting for his life in a hospital bed. When he died, the world lost more than a rapper, it lost a voice that challenged power, injustice, and hypocrisy. Just months later, Biggie Smalls was gunned down in Los Angeles, sealing one of the darkest chapters in music history. Many believe his death was part of the same chain reaction driven by retaliation, fear, and unfinished business. Two legends gone and no one held accountable. Decades later, both murders remain officially unsolved. No convictions, no closure. But the documentary forces viewers to confront an uncomfortable reality. Just because a case is unsolved doesn't mean the truth is unknown. Through testimonies, insider accounts, and recorded admissions, 50 Cent's project suggests that the answers have always been there, protected by influence and silence. This story is not just about Tupac and Biggie. It is about what happens when power goes unchecked, when money outweighs morality, and when an industry values profit over human life. It raises questions that go far beyond hip-hop. Who is protected when fame becomes armor? How many voices were silenced because speaking up was too dangerous? And how many truths are still buried, waiting for someone brave enough to bring them into the light? As the documentary ends, one question lingers in the air: will this finally change anything? Will these revelations push authorities to reopen cases? Or will they fade into the same void as every other unanswered question? For fans, for families, and for the culture itself, hope still remains. Because as long as people keep talking, the truth can never fully disappear. And for Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G., the world is still waiting not just for answers, but for justice. Before we begin, take a moment to understand the weight of this story. This is not just about music, fame, or celebrity drama. This is about power, silence, and a system that allowed two of the most influential voices of a generation to be erased without accountability. Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G. were more than rappers. They were cultural icons, storytellers, and voices of a generation that spoke about pain, struggle, and truth. When they were murdered, the world was told to move on, to accept mystery instead of justice. But the truth is, the culture never moved on. The questions never disappeared. They were simply buried beneath time, fear, and influence. For decades, fans have searched for answers, dissecting interviews, lyrics, police reports, and rumors. Every few years, a new theory would surface, only to be silenced or dismissed. The cases remained officially unsolved. Yet many people close to the situation always claimed the truth was known, it just couldn't be spoken out loud. That silence didn't come from confusion. It came from power. Power that protected certain names, power that controlled narratives, and power that made people afraid to speak. And that is what makes this story so uncomfortable even today. When 50 Cent began speaking publicly about the deaths of Tupac and Biggie, it didn't sound like nostalgia or clout chasing. It sounded like frustration. Like someone who had seen too much and decided he was done playing along. When he hinted at a list of powerful figures allegedly connected to these murders, it sent shockwaves through the industry. Old tensions resurfaced, and suddenly, people who had stayed quiet for years started paying attention again. Because when someone like 50 Cent speaks, it's not accidental. It's calculated. Then came the documentary. Quietly released on Netflix, it didn't arrive with loud promotion or flashy trailers. Yet within hours, it dominated conversations online. People described it as something they didn't even realize they had been waiting for. A documentary that didn't glorify success, didn't protect legacies, and didn't soften the truth. Instead, it came with raw footage, unheard audio recordings, and testimonies from people who were actually there when history was being written behind closed doors. Watching it feels unsettling, not because of what it shows, but because of what it confirms. Former Bad Boy Records employees and artists describe an environment built on fear, pressure, and manipulation. The glamour seen on television masked a darker reality where control mattered more than creativity, and loyalty was demanded, not earned. As the documentary moves deeper, the tone shifts from industry politics to something far more dangerous. When the conversation turns to Tupac and Biggie, the atmosphere changes completely. These were not random acts of violence. They were the final outcomes of choices made long before the trigger was pulled. Multiple voices begin to describe how rivalries were encouraged instead of stopped, how egos were fed instead of managed, and how conflict became profitable. The East Coast versus West Coast war is often remembered as a clash between artists. But those closest to the situation tell a different story. They claim the artists were trapped in a system designed to thrive on chaos. Executives, managers, and power players were the ones steering the narrative, while young artists carried the consequences. As tensions escalated, the music was no longer enough. Diss tracks turned into real threats. Studio beef turned into street confrontations. And eventually, gangs entered the picture, changing everything. Once street politics became involved, there was no going back. What began as an industry rivalry evolved into something deadly, something uncontrollable. According to the documentary, connections between the music industry and street figures were not accidental. They were maintained, protected, and, in some cases, relied upon. The most chilling moments arrive when recorded conversations are played, featuring Dwayne "Keffy D. Davis in these recordings, paired with commentary from a former police detective. Keffy D openly discusses the events surrounding the night Tupac Shakur was shot in Las Vegas in 1996. His words are calm, almost casual, as he admits involvement in the attack alongside Orlando Anderson. For years, fans suspected this truth. Hearing it spoken so plainly strips away any remaining doubt. Tupac fought for his life for days after the shooting, but eventually, the world lost one of its most powerful voices. What followed only deepened the tragedy. Just months later, Biggie Smalls was murdered in Los Angeles. Another young life taken. Another case left unresolved. Many believe his death was part of the same chain reaction, retaliation fueled by fear, ego, and unfinished business. Two legends gone and a culture left without closure. No arrests, no convictions, just silence. Decades have passed, but silence does not equal innocence. The documentary doesn't pretend to be a courtroom verdict, but it does something far more dangerous. It forces the truth back into the conversation. It reminds the world that unsolved does not mean unknown, that justice delayed is often justice denied, and that history, when left unchallenged, becomes a lie people are forced to accept. This story is not just about Tupac and Biggie. It is about an industry that protects power over people, profit over life, and image over truth. It is about how silence becomes policy and fear becomes control. And most importantly, it is about whether the culture is finally ready to stop looking away. Because as long as people keep asking questions, the truth can never fully disappear. And for Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G., the world is still waiting, not for rumors, not for theories, but for justice. What makes this story even more disturbing is how normalized everything became afterward. The industry moved on as if nothing had happened. Award shows continued, albums dropped, fortunes were made, and new stars replaced the old ones. Tupac and Biggie were honored in words, but never in justice. Behind the scenes, the same system that allowed their deaths to go unanswered continued to thrive. The people with power remained protected, while the truth stayed locked behind legal walls, fear, and influence. Over time, the narrative shifted from who did it to it doesn't matter anymore, and that may have been the most dangerous outcome of all. For many artists who came after Tupac and Biggie, their deaths became unspoken warnings. Warnings about speaking too freely, about challenging the wrong people, and about understanding how deep the industry really goes. Several insiders have admitted over the years that they knew more than they ever said publicly. But survival mattered more than truth. Careers, families, and lives were on the line. In an industry where contracts can disappear overnight and protection is never guaranteed, silence often feels like the only option. That silence, however, came at a cost: the erasure of accountability. The documentary also forces viewers to confront how media played a role in fueling the chaos. Headlines exaggerated conflict, interviews encouraged rivalry, and diss tracks were treated like entertainment instead of warning signs. Violence was marketed as authenticity, and artists were pushed to live out the personas that sold records. When things finally crossed the line, the same media that amplified the tension stepped back, leaving destruction behind. In the end, the culture paid the price for a narrative that was profitable but deadly. What makes 50 Cent's documentary so powerful is not just the allegations, but the timing. We are living in an era where people are no longer willing to accept silence as an answer. The public is more aware of how power operates behind closed doors, and there is growing pressure to revisit stories that were once considered untouchable. This project arrives at a moment when the culture is finally asking harder questions, not just about what happened, but about why nothing happened afterward. Even now, the legal system remains slow to act. While names have been mentioned and connections discussed, official justice remains distant. But history has shown that truth does not always arrive through courtrooms alone. Sometimes it arrives through persistence, through conversation, and through a refusal to let stories die. Every time these names are spoken, every time the facts are revisited, the silence loses a little more power. As time passes, one thing becomes clear: Tupac and Biggie were not just victims of gun violence, but victims of a system that failed to protect them and then failed to honor them properly. Their deaths changed hip-hop forever, but not in the way it should have. Instead of lessons learned, there was fear. Instead of accountability, there was denial. And instead of closure, there was a void that still hasn't been filled. In the end, this story leaves us with uncomfortable questions that don't have easy answers. What happens when those with power are never held responsible? How many truths remain buried because exposing them threatens the system itself? And how many lives were indirectly affected by decisions made in silence? These questions matter not just for the past, but for the future of the culture. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that ignoring the truth doesn't make it disappear.